Welcome to Exploring Santa Cruz, a bi-weekly program hosted by Jean Kratzer and Mathilde Rand. I am Mathilde Rand, and today's program is called In the Tides of Time. I am speaking with Alan Counihan about his work, which, as he once said, is an exploration and hopefully enrichment of the human experience of place. Alan Counihan is a visual artist or sculptor, focused on the specificity of place. Born in Ireland, he lived 20 years in the US and was involved with many private and commissioned projects. In 1994, Santa Cruz commissioned him for a sculpture at the wharf called In the Tides of Time. It was dedicated on April 28, 1995. Two other sculptures by Alan Counihan are located in Santa Cruz County: Windfalls in Willowbrook Park in SoCal and Blacklight in Frederick Street Park in Santa Cruz. In the year 2000, he returned to Ireland with his wife, Gypsy Ray. Welcome to the program, Alan.
Thank you, Mathilde.
Could you start us off how your career in visual art started?
It's not the long story of going to art college and getting a degree. I used to work as a stonemason, and I think the real introduction was that Gypsy, my wife, was a wonderful practicing artist when I met her. I think it was really with her encouragement. It took 10 years at least before I started to practice. But I was working as a stonemason when we lived together in Santa Cruz. And I think I'd learned or discovered the limits of that trade and craft and wanted to expand it beyond doing purely practical work. And at the time also, the Gulf War was just happening. And I really had difficulty with some experiences I had when working for people. And I wanted to go into a studio and to start carving. And Gypsy, who was working in Cabrillo at the time, really very kindly said, "Alan, take a year out and I will support you. I will cover our finances, rent a studio and get to work." And that's really how I began my work as a sculptor.
Living in Santa Cruz, your first sculpture was Blacklight in Frederick Street Park. How did that come about?
The Santa Cruz City Arts Commission had some very, very small commissions. The public art program was really it was nascent at the time. It was only growing. Susan Wandruff used to work with the City Arts Commission at the time. Very small grant came up, City Arts grant, and I applied for it. And it was to make a sculpture. The budget was really small, $2,000. But for an opportunity to make my first piece of public art in our local park, because we only lived a couple of hundred yards away from Frederick Street, where we walked almost daily, it was a joy to make it. It was inexpensive, but because I knew the place so well, this little piece of work just seemed to sit in there very nicely.
And then Windfalls in Willowbrook in SoCal.
Again, the opportunities that seemed to arrive, that was a commission for a new park, which was being built in SoCal. And there was a percent for art scheme coming with most of these projects. The budget for that was pretty small. I think that may have been 10,000. But of course, I was only starting out. And so for me, this was wonderful money. And to be able to make work on commission was a real privilege. And working with the city at the time, the city were very, very encouraging. So Parks and Rec, everybody tried to make things happen. So it's the payment in kind that you got, the cooperation that really allowed you to do much, much more than you might originally have envisaged.
Did the fact that you had done two projects commissioned by the city, did the third one, In the Tides of Time, did that come to them because of an application or because they sought you out?
No, In the Tides of Time, that was a much, much bigger budget. That was a $40,000 budget. That was advertised, maybe not nationally, but certainly within the state. And I applied for it. And probably having worked with landscape architects and working as a stonemason on some very, very large projects, I wasn't afraid of large budgets. There is a formula in when you're doing this kind of work. If you make a good proposal and you present your work in a very clear way and people can grasp it, that's part of the process. It's a bit like being good at an interview, if you like. A lot of the people sitting on panels sometimes have difficulty visualizing. And if you anticipate that and make it really clear and straightforward, and most importantly with the city, if you bring in the health and safety aspect and look at it that you've got kind of everything covered, your chances of securing the commission are far greater.
And what was their theme? Did they have a theme?
They had no theme and they offered none. They wanted a landmark sculpture at the gateway entrance to the new wharf. The site was pretty much predetermined. I mean, it could have been anywhere along there, I chose that particular place because it supported the work, because there's huge weight in that. But there was no theme. Anybody could have suggested anything, but obviously I wanted to stick with the material that came out of the ocean. The stone I used is sedimentary limestone. It's full of fossils, it's full of shells. So it spoke basically of the sea already. And being a kind of a portal, which is the form, it suggests arrivals and departures. And that just seemed to me on the edge of the tide, the edge of the sea, perfect for a seaside coastal town.
There are these seeding areas, but they look like seeds of some big fruit.
Yes, I was working on a series at the time with the sculpture in Willowbrook Park. They're kind of fruit forms or seed forms. So the idea in the Tides of Time is that you have the portal, but going around it, you have what looks like a large round fruit. And then going away from that or towards that, circling around it, are 4 quarters of a sphere.
Mm-hmm.
And they're split in that they look like maybe a sliced pear, but they also suggest the splitting of a hull or a seed form.
Yeah.
That's really what I wanted. But they also suggest boats.
Yep.
And so there's the voyage of the seed through the fruit, through death, if you like, and back into rebirth. So that cyclical passage is something I was dealing with in my sculpture at the time.
And that's why you wrote this poem, right?
That's right. In the Tides of Time, we have found safe harbor. That was part of it. I was very fortunate in that I was an immigrant and I had been living in this city for since 1980, most of the time. And Proposition 187 was coming in. That was much in the news in 1984, which was complicated. I think it was under the Save Our State ballot initiative. It was to deny health and education to people who were illegal immigrants, even emergency healthcare. So that was kind of troubling at the time. And I just felt I was so fortunate. I just wanted this to be a sculpture of welcome to a land of bounty.
Do you have the poem in front of you? Would you like to read it?
In the Tides of Time, we have found safe harbor here on this western shore, where the waves ebb and flow restlessly, and the seasons in their old harvest hulls have borne us ripe cargoes of plenty, with enough fruit for all. And that last line was the important one,
yes.
With enough fruit for all. My close friend, David Sweet, I asked David, would he care to translate the poem into, I suppose, what was California's second language? Some would say it's first language.
Yes. May I read that in Spanish?
Oh, please.
Yeah. En las mareas del tiempo hemos buscado puerto seguro, aquí en esta costa occidental, donde fluye y refluye la oleada sin descanso y las estaciones. En sus viejos coscas de cosecha nos han aportado maduras cargas de abundancia, con fruto suficiente para todos. It is almost even more beautiful in Spanish than it is.
It sounds lovely, yes.
It really struck me. And then, of course, standing there reading it on the inside of the portal, I had different thoughts going through my mind, walking around, seeing the big round ball, and then the fruit, and then the portal. Your poem really helped me to think about people coming into this country, across the ocean, and coming in, being in the harbor, and then coming to this portal. It gave me a warm feeling of, this is the land of opportunity, of abundance, to be shared by all who come here, who want to enrich and strengthen this country. Did you have a specific meaning that you wanted to bring across?
No, but hearing you say that, then it means that the sculpture is in some way successful. You have to leave it open. Be very careful in making your art that it's not didactic. In other words, and be very careful not to present a history, but to encourage a reflection on it. So to open something out and that people can approach it in many ways and read it in many ways. Right. That's really what I wanted to do. It is one of my favorite pieces, and it's one of the few pieces that's ever made it into a comic strip.
Serious?
Yeah, and I used to keep it on the fridge here. I think it appeared that there was a comic strip in the Sentinel. It appeared in each frame of the comic strip. What was happening in the little story was happening on the sculpture, and that was nice. You know, it's kind of iconic of the place somewhat.
Uh-huh. Talk to me about the process of getting the sculpture there, because I understand you did some work in Ireland on the sculpture. Is that
I
correct?
did, because yes, the stone is actually Kilkenny limestone from the county where I live. It's a quarry I had associations with, but it was the only stone I knew that was a sedimentary limestone that was strong enough to withstand the elements, strong enough to withstand an earthquake if it was correctly made. But that, most importantly, that was full of fossils and shells that spoke of the place. And because I had a good relationship with the quarry, I knew that I could work in the quarry on the piece, which I couldn't do in California in any quarry. And that the stone would be more economical, even though including the shipping, for me to make in Ireland or rough out in Ireland. Then I shipped it over to California. And at the time, I was renting a studio space from Angela Grova at Michelangelo Studios opposite South Tannery on River Street. And so I was able to complete the sculpture there and then bring it from my studio down to the wharf.
And I understand there was a whole crew involved because it is heavy.
It's very heavy. And actually, somebody was asking me about that only the other day, a couple of days ago when we were walking. They were surprised at shipping a sculpture from Ireland in a container all the way over to California. They were, how complicated and dangerous that must be. The worst part of the journey was actually from my studio down to the wharf, because the city brought a low loader, and the sphere, I had it all rigged up and stuff, but I couldn't use chains because I would mark the surface. So we loaded it up, I think, using forklifts and things onto the low loader and drove it down Front Street very, very early in the morning so that we wouldn't meet anybody. And as I drove behind it, and as we were coming near the credit union, it started to rock on the thing. And there was a woman on the far side, on the pavement pushing a pram. And I have to say, my heart was in my mouth. I think it was a bump in the road that started the ball to rock. I was just, when these things get momentum, I was afraid it would roll, but it didn't. And we got it down there. And there was lots of friends helped, artist friends from the community. There's no need to mention them by name. Jamie Abbott and Linda Watson, and lots of people came and helped with the installation. It was a lovely time.
The sculpture itself shares a bond between people and being welcome to people. And at the same time, the whole process from Ireland to here, to the rented studio, with the crew, with the friends, getting it to the wharf. You really brought people together. It's amazing.
It did. It felt like that. And yet there was an article appeared in the Sentinel which was unfavorable. I suppose vanity has prevented me from keeping it. I really have been looking for it because I found all these letters that, of course, they would have been artist friends who wrote in defense of the piece and what was said about it. Not everybody responds favorably to public art.
But, it is free speech.
Indeed,
critique,
yeah.
And you definitely got a conversation going. I recommend people go to the wharf and really take in the poem, stand there, look at different directions and see what they get out of this. And I really appreciate your explanation of Proposition 187, the tide of times, basically, you're expressing. It's not just water coming back and forth, creating the tide, but also the stone and what happened geologically, but then also the emotional and experiential. Thank you so much. I've been there many times, but it was when I started preparing for this that I really took in the sculpture. And thank you for that.
You're very welcome.
This is not the only thing you've done in California. I want you to talk about the project you did in San Jose with the Casanova Aloni commemoration. Can you tell us a little bit about how that came about and what it personally meant to you also?
That was a national competition. I had been working on a ranch up near Mount Hamilton. I'd been given an opportunity to make a sculpture there, maybe 2 years previously, to express the ghosts of that landscape. And I spent a lot of time up there, and I didn't know, how do you commemorate a people who left nothing behind them? A monument to the Aloni sounds like a contradiction in terms, because baskets might be the most that they left behind them, or a mortar and pestle. So I ended up spending some evenings up there, sleeping in my truck. And I remember waking one morning and hearing the acorns just bouncing off the branches of the trees and my truck. And I made a piece up there basically based on these seed forms, which were the sustenance of the Ohlone. And I made that piece and I was very happy with it. And in doing that, in all my time in California, there wasn't much open conversation about the indigenous people of the area. It was a wonderful eye-opener to me, and I'd learned an enormous amount, and then I started to read a great deal around the subject. So when the commission came up to commemorate the Counihan Ohlone for the city of San Jose, I was drawn to it, but I was very, very nervous because public art is, it's a very difficult field to work in. I mean, the budgets can be big, but you have to compromise a lot. The exciting part is in the design, which might last a month, and then you spend kind of 6 or 7 months of fabrication, and you cannot deviate from your original proposal. So it's a bit like factory work. That can be very, very challenging. But I was really drawn to this. And I do remember walking with a friend by the beach. He said, apply. So I applied, and I was very, very fortunate to receive the commission. And it was a very large budget. I think it was about $195,000. It's a difficult one to talk about because that one was already extremely, extremely politicized. The commission had been offered 2 or 3 years previously, but the process had ground to a halt because of political differences within the Ohlone community. Some people felt that they weren't being represented. And indeed, at the selection panel, it was kind of suggested to the artists there that they talk to certain groups and that they don't talk to certain others. It was an extremely complex and challenging commission on all levels, artistic, political.
Since the specificity of place was at the core of your work, what did you learn from this project about the importance of place?
That's a tricky one. I'm not sure that I captured it in this work. The only link to place that was left there really is language. Language is the most potent link to place through place names. It's particularly the case here in Ireland, for example. Every field has a name, every hill has a name, every rock has a name. I've no doubt but that with the indigenous people in their own landscape, it was equally well known. But those names have disappeared because the language has disappeared. In a city, in a park, the area was already designated where this work would go. It was very difficult to know, how do I express the ghosts of a landscape or commemorate a people who don't in some sense want to be commemorated as a past culture, but to be recognized as a living culture. That's what I tried to do in the work. And there were some constraints on that because I could not engage with the whole of the Ohlone community. I do remember going to one powwow and meeting some Counihan Ohlone and being introduced to them as working on the design of a sculpture. And he said, please do not make a statue of a monk and a child. Other Counihan Ohlone were coming up with some senses that I should present a kind of a cornucopia of a shell form in which, all this bounty of the earth spilled out. So they had something pre-imagined, they had their preferences for what they wanted from the work and were very clear about what they didn't want from the work. Mm-hmm. And I tried to find a way to acknowledge what had happened to the people in the past, which was through the mission records and through the 1850s, that people suffered terribly. And the enormous diversity of the Counihan Ohlone community, to express that and to show it as a continuum by using the basket motif woven in the pavement, showing that culture is not static. To live, it must continually be woven. So it can be seen as unraveling, which I don't want it to be seen as, but to be actually seen as being woven in the moment.
And then in the corner, you have
the mortar and the pestle, and these were for grinding the acorns. And there was a tradition that when a woman died, the mortar would be upturned and split, marking the death. So that's the 2 seat forms that are at the either end of this giant gift basket represent the broken tradition, if you like. What's happening in the middle between those and the giant gift basket, which is this finished form, is the pattern in the pavement being woven through an acknowledgement of the historical record.
Did you bring people together around this?
No, unfortunately, no. It was the most challenging public art commission I've ever done. And it had to be done, but I felt that, how can I put this? There was no dedication ceremony. I think that says it all.
That is amazing, because I saw the picture on the website, and your explanation of it is really striking to me.
There's several things to recognize there, Matilda. There is the acknowledgement of the historical record, which I think is Every country needs to do that. History is usually written by the victors. But within the Indigenous community itself, relationships are also fractious. There's no doubt that the Costa and Ohlone within California, while they would be pleased to see that the city acknowledged or attempted to commemorate them and fulfilled its obligations, if you like, its cultural obligations, in commissioning the work in the first place and realizing it, the fact that they chose an artist from Ireland with blue eyes to speak for another people, they realize it's not their work, if you follow me.
Yeah.
Because the original commission had been awarded, and Ground to Halt was awarded to 2 Indigenous artists.
But that didn't happen.
That didn't happen because of fractious relationships within that community. And these are the reasons, I presume, why there was no great press coverage and why the work fell into disrepair. It was untended, grass was growing through it. It was disappointing to revisit.
Again, the tides of time.
Perhaps, but the tides of time, I mean, the city are very good in Santa Cruz. People care about the work, and that's pleasing.
That is. So, Alan, I understand that, like in the Tides of Time, the Ohlone project was fabricated in Ireland and transported to the US in a container. Can you share a little bit about that process?
Yes, but it was exactly the same as with the Tides of Time. Again, I worked with the same Kilkenny limestone. I worked in the same quarry, but because the work was so much bigger and involved so much more time in the fabrication, I worked for maybe 6, 7, 8 months in the quarry every day, and they designated a particular place for me. With public liability insurance, I don't believe it would have been possible to do it anywhere else. It was awarded, I think, in 2000. Gypsy and I had decided to move back to Ireland in the year 2000, so I was able to make the work while we began our lives here. And in November 2001, it was installed in San Jose. Mm-hmm. But the commission, I mean, we've already spoken about the commission and how complicated it was, but it wasn't all a dark process because the commission fee, accompanied by Gypsy's resources, it allowed us to achieve something we could never have afforded in Santa Cruz, which was to buy land in Ireland in a beautiful place, build our own home, and build 2 separate studios upon it. The move came at a great cost in that we became physically separated from our community of friends in Santa Cruz. And it was even more challenging for Gypsy Ray, my wife, than for myself, because she was leaving a community of artists in which she was even more deeply embedded than myself, and within which she'd made a wonderful contribution to the cultural life of Santa Cruz City and County over the previous 25 years. I think it was somewhat easier for me moving here because I'm Irish and was in some sense coming home. But for Gypsy, it was like starting out all over again from scratch at 50 years of age in a new country where nobody was familiar with her work. But given the person she was, it changed very quickly because in the past 20 years, she did exactly in Kilkenny, Ireland, what she had done in Santa Cruz, which was just to immerse herself creatively in community and enable other lives. And we did that through the exploration of place.
Again,
in 2008, there was an economic crash, and we had established ourselves here. We've been living here for 8 years, but the art world dried up. There was no commissions, there was no sales. It just dried up. So we decided to create art out of our everyday lives here by exploring the land in which we lived, because we were strangers in some sense into the community, and we used our creative practices to embed ourselves here. We worked with our local neighbors. We wanted them to see that the work that we did within the land was as relevant in some sense as the work that they did in the land. We documented their lives. We gathered all the place names in the parish. We gathered all the local folklore and devised a theatre project, which we worked with the local school. And then we had symposia, and we created a large publication out of it. But it was all about place, and it was about the place that we live in. And it did become something of a landmark project because it became a model of participation. And so place was central to that.
Is that the Townlands project that you're talking about now? Yeah.
That's it. It was extremely rewarding.
Can you tell a little bit more about the Townlands project?
The Heritage Council, which is a state body in Ireland, was really, really impressed with the project. And so it decided to fund the gathering of place names, which I coordinated county-wide. And so that was a project that was ongoing for 10 years. It came to a close. I mean, I had to stop last year when Gypsy was ill, but it's ongoing. It has a life of its own. So something that began in 2009 still has a legacy. It was a wonderful, wonderful project. And Gypsy's own practice continued through kind of an exploration of a rural landscape in photograph, but particularly in paint and drawing. That grew out of that and became a major, major strand of her own work.
So something else grew from that, right? The Great Dormant project.
These projects were self-generated. They weren't commissioned. I came across the Grange Gorman project through a documentary where I discovered that the personal belongings of patients from a mental hospital were discovered in the attics of that. And nobody knew to whom they belonged. Well, they did, but they never were returned to its owners. I got permission to use them from the National Health Board, and I created, I suppose, an artwork out of it, but it was really an investigative project about the history of mental institutions, about the abuse of human rights. And it was the most profound project I've ever done in the sense of its effect upon people. And that's evident in the visitors' books. People came to the exhibition and were so moved that they just wanted to tell me their story. And then they wanted me to find out about their relatives. It was cathartic. I mean, it was cathartic for me to create it, but it was very, very cathartic to watch its effect on others because everybody was touched. And the same, I suppose it's a tragedy of sorts, the same treatment of individuals, disrespect for others, was as evident in American institutional history as it is in Ireland, as it is in almost every country. It's how we care for those or don't care for others, or those that we consider other.
That is amazing. And you not only did a creative project, but you also did a radio commentary, walking on the cemetery and talking about the stones. That was very moving to me because it really connected me with people that I don't know, but it sounded like a universal concept that hit me, although different. And so I really thank you for bringing us to that understanding.
Yes, and again, radio was a wonderful documentary for that. The installations I created around that project might have reached maybe 4 installations, might have reached 1,000 people. The radio documentary is the best thing I think I've ever done from the point of view of public art. It reached an audience of hundreds of thousands. And it is about people. You mentioned the graves. We discovered thousands of people who were buried in unmarked graves because they were abandoned into the institutions and neglected and forgotten about.
Well, I know we only talk about it briefly, but on the website, on the blog, we will have links to your work as well as the radio commentary and the video that I talked about, salvage and reuse. Well, I think we heard plenty of explanations why you call your work exploration and hopefully enrichment of the human experience of place. Alan, I want to thank you so much for speaking with me.
It's my pleasure, Matilda.
And I want to thank our listeners for tuning in to Exploring Santa Cruz on KSQD Santa Cruz. On the blog post, you will find links to Alan's website, YouTube video, and articles, as well as this broadcast. Go to ksqd.org/In the Tides of Time, with dashes between in the tides of time. Thank you and see you next time.